The snow in Moscow that December did not fall. It drifted like ash over a funeral pyre. It was 1991, and the air held a strange metallic taste, the scent of a superpower decomposing. For 7 decades, the Soviet Union had been a monolith of concrete and ideology, a world where the state was the sun around which all lives orbited. Then, almost overnight, the sun went out. To the millions of citizens huddled in their overcoats, the collapse felt like a slow-motion car crash. It was the sound of the hammer and sickle being lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, not with a roar of revolution, but with the dry, pathetic rasp of a rope sliding through a pulley. As the red flag descended, a void opened up beneath the feet of nearly 300 million people, and in that void, the 7 devils found their playground. The empire's last breath was drawn in the kitchens of cramped Khrushchevka apartments, where families sat around flickering television sets, watching news anchors who looked as terrified as their viewers. The ruble, once a symbol of socialist stability, was dying. Inflation didn't just rise, it soared like a bird of prey. A man could go to sleep with a lifetime of savings in his bank account and wake up to find it was barely enough to buy a single egg. This was the birth of the lawless frontier. In the West, they called it the end of history. In Moscow, they called it katastroika. The transition to what the economists coldly termed shock therapy was a brutal stripping of the nation's skin. The price controls were lifted, and the ghost of the free market returned with a vengeance. On the sidewalks of the Tverskaya, the new reality was on display. It was a bizarre, desperate bazaar. A professor of nuclear physics stood in the slush, holding a pair of worn leather boots he hoped to trade for milk. Next to him, a retired Red Army colonel offered his medals, decorations for bravery at Stalingrad, to any tourist with a $5 bill. Everything was for sale: dignity, history, and the very dirt beneath their feet. As the masses scrambled for bread, the men who would become the 7 devils were busy mapping the ruins. They were not like the old Communist Party bosses with their stiff suits and stone faces. These were young men, often outsiders, with minds like calculators and hearts of ice. They understood that in a country where no one owned anything, the man who claimed everything first would become a king. They watched as the great state enterprises, the massive oil fields of Siberia, the nickel mines of the Arctic, the steel mills of the Urals, became orphans. The state could no longer pay the workers, let alone maintain the machinery. These giants, the crown jewels of the Russian soul, were sitting in the dark, waiting for a master. The devils began their work in the shadows of the crumbling ministries. They moved through the corridors of power with suitcases full of cash and promises of a future that the old bureaucrats couldn't imagine. They realized that the law was no longer a set of rules, but a commodity to be bought and sold. If you wanted a law changed, you bought the minister. If you wanted a competitor gone, you bought the police. And if you wanted the world's largest oil company, you simply waited for the auction that only you were invited to attend. Violence became the punctuation mark of every business deal. In the absence of a functioning legal system, the mafia became the shadow government. The sound of Mercedes-Benz engines and the sudden rat-a-tat-tat of Kalashnikovs echoed through the night. Business meetings didn't happen in boardrooms, they happened in bulletproof SUVs. It was a time of roofing, the krisha, where every business owner had to pay a protector, whether that protector wore a leather jacket or a police uniform. The 7 devils, however, were above the street thugs. They were the architects of the great heist. They knew that the real wealth wasn't in the cash registers of grocery stores, it was in the ledgers of the central bank. They began to build private banks that were little more than vacuum cleaners, designed to suck up the remaining wealth of the nation. They took the people's deposits, used them to buy state assets for pennies, and then watched as hyperinflation wiped out the value of what they owed the people. It was a heist of such scale that the human mind struggled to grasp it. A factory that had cost the labor of 3 generations to build was sold for the price of a luxury apartment in Manhattan. A mountain of gold was traded for a fleet of armored cars. As the first winter of the new Russia set in, the divide was absolute. On one side was the lost generation, the elderly who died of cold in their unheated flats, the soldiers who returned from abandoned outposts to find their country gone, and the children who learned to sniff glue to forget the hunger. On the other side were the 7 devils in their circle, dining on beluga caviar and sipping French champagne while they discussed the privatization of the motherland. The frontier was open. There were no fences, no guards, and no conscience. The Soviet Union had spent 70 years trying to build a world without greed, only to collapse into a world where greed was the only thing left alive. The empire had taken its last breath, and as the body grew cold, the feast of the vultures began. In the gilded halls of the Kremlin, new President Boris Yeltsin sat with a glass of vodka, surrounded by the very men who were picking the country clean. He needed their money to stay in power. They needed his signature to stay rich. It was a blood pact signed in the ruins. The Russian people were promised democracy, but what they received was an auction, and the 7 devils were the only ones with the chips to play. The story of the looting of Russia began not with a grand plan, but with this singular, terrifying moment of chaos, the moment when a nation of millions realized that the only thing more dangerous than a cruel state is no state at all. In the lawless frontier, everything had a price, and the price of Russia was far lower than anyone dared to imagine. In the smoke-filled private clubs of Moscow, where the scent of imported Cuban cigars mingled with the stale odor of Soviet-era floor wax, the future was being carved into pieces. If the collapse of the Soviet Union was the explosion, the architects of chaos were the men who knew how to harvest the shrapnel. They were known as the Semi-Bankirshchensa, the 7 bankers, but to the Russian people, they would forever be the 7 devils. They were an eclectic group of predators, a mix of mathematicians, scientists, and street-smart hustlers who shared one common trait, an absence of vertigo when standing at the edge of an abyss. While the rest of the world looked at the falling statues of Lenin and saw the end of an era, these 7 men looked at the map of Russia and saw a grocery store where the cashier had gone missing. In the center of this orbit was Boris Berezovsky, a man with a frantic, nervous energy and the mind of a grandmaster. A former mathematician, Berezovsky understood the logic of systems and, more importantly, how to break them. He didn't want to build a factory, he wanted to own the air the factory breathed. He was the ultimate courtier, a man who realized early on that in the new Russia, the shortest distance between a man and $1 billion was a friendship with the president's daughter. Berezovsky was the philosopher of the group. Everything is for sale, he would famously remark, including the soul of the nation. He began by selling cars, turning a state-owned dealership into a private piggy bank, but his true masterpiece was control of Channel 1, the television station that reached every corner of the frozen tundra. He knew that if you controlled what people saw, you controlled what they believed, and if you controlled what they believed, you could rob them while they cheered for you. Then there was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the youngest and perhaps the most disciplined of the devils. He was a former leader in the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, which gave him the ultimate paradox, a black belt in communist bureaucracy and a heart of a cutthroat capitalist. Khodorkovsky didn't waste time with the petty street fights of the mafia. He opened one of the first private banks, Bank Menatep. While ordinary Russians were hiding their rubles under mattresses as inflation ate them alive, Khodorkovsky was using his political connections to handle the government's money. He became the state's laundromat, and for his service, he was allowed to buy Yukos, an oil giant, for a price that wouldn't have bought a mid-sized hotel in London. The room where these men met was often thick with a tension that could draw blood. They didn't like each other. In any other time, they would have been each other's prey. But in the early 90s, they realized that Russia was too big for one man to loot alone. They needed a pact. Vladimir Gusinsky was the media mogul,
the man who built NTV, the only independent voice that could rival Berezovsky's propaganda. He was a former theater director, and he treated the looting of Russia like a grand stage play. He knew that information was a weapon of mass destruction. By exposing the corruption of his rivals while hiding his own, he kept the public in a state of constant, bewildered anger, a smokescreen that allowed the Big Seven to move in silence. Alexander Smolenski was the banker of the people, or so he claimed. His SBS Agrobank grew into a monster by absorbing the life savings of millions of babushkas. He was a man who had once been sentenced to hard labor for illegal business activities in the Soviet era. Now he was writing the laws he used to break. When the ruble eventually crashed, Smolenski's bank collapsed, taking the dreams of millions with him. He didn't blink. He had already moved the gold to Switzerland. Mikhail Friedman and Pyotr Avin of the Alpha Group were the intellectuals of the heist.
Mikhail Friedman and Pyotr Avin of the Alpha Group were the intellectuals of the heist. Friedman, a man who started by reselling theater tickets, had a shark's instinct for weakness. They didn't rely on the flamboyant corruption of Berezovsky. They built a corporate empire that looked Western on the outside, but was fueled by the raw, lawless energy of the East. They were the ones who realized that the Wild East would eventually need to be laundered into global capital. Finally, there was Vladimir Potanin, the strategist. He was the one who dreamed up the loans for shares scheme, the single greatest sleight of hand in financial history. Potanin was a product of the Soviet elite, a man who knew exactly which buttons to push in the dark hallways of the Kremlin. He didn't just want money, he wanted the earth itself. He set his sights on Norilsk Nickel, a company that produced a massive percentage of the world's nickel and palladium. Under his plan, the banks would lend money to the cash-strapped government, and if the government couldn't pay it back, which everyone knew they couldn't, the banks would inherit the nation's industries. It was like lending a man $1 for his house and then kicking him into the snow the next morning. Together, these architects of chaos turned the transition to capitalism into a siege. They weren't building a market, they were building a monopoly. They divided the ministries among themselves like warlords dividing a conquered city. One took the oil, one took the gas, one took the media, and one took the banks. The American advisors in Washington watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. They had wanted Russia to embrace the invisible hand of the market. What they got was the invisible fist of the oligarchs. The Seven Devils didn't care about the Chicago School of Economics. They cared about the Darwinian reality of the Moscow streets. As the decade wore on, these 7 men became more powerful than the Russian state itself. They could make a phone call and fire a prime minister. They could decide which wars were fought and which strikes were crushed. They were the masters of the ruins, the men who had looked at the corpse of a superpower and seen not a tragedy, but a feast. But the chaos they orchestrated had a price. By destroying the law to enrich themselves, they created a world where only the strongest survived. They thought they were the strongest. They thought they had built a system that would last forever, a world where the 7 devils would rule from their villas in the French Riviera, while Russia remained their private ATM. They forgot one thing. Chaos is a fire that eventually consumes its architects. In the shadows of the chaos they created, a different kind of predator was watching. A man from the secret services, a man who didn't care about money as much as he cared about order. But that was a nightmare for another day. For now, in the mid-90s, the sun never set on the empire of the Big Seven. They had bought the world's largest country, and the auction was still going on. In the autumn of 1992, every citizen of the newly minted Russian Federation received a strange, colorful slip of paper in the mail. It was a privatization voucher, decorated with an image of the White House of Russia and stamped with a nominal value of 10,000 rubles. To the idealistic reformers in Moscow, these slips were the tickets to the capitalist paradise, a way to give every Russian a stake in the factories, mines, and oil fields that their sweat had built over 70 years.
Anatoly Chubais, the architect of the plan, famously promised that 2 vouchers would eventually be worth 2 Volga cars. To the Russian people, who were currently trading their winter coats for sausages, the vouchers looked like a cruel joke. To the 7 devils, however, these slips of paper were the keys to the kingdom. This was the era of vouchers and villains, the moment when the collective wealth of a superpower was liquidated and concentrated into 7 pairs of hands. The tragedy of the voucher system was rooted in the timing. When the vouchers were distributed, the Russian economy was in a state of freefall. Hyperinflation had turned the 10,000 ruble value into a mockery. By the time the ink was dry, that amount of money could barely buy a few kilos of butter or a crate of cheap vodka. The common man, confused by the sudden death of the only economic system he had ever known, saw no value in a piece of paper that promised ownership in a distant, rusting Siberian steel mill. The 7 devils understood the psychology of the hungry. They mobilized an army of collectors, predators in leather jackets who set up folding tables outside metro stations, factory gates, and village squares. "Why wait for a Volga car that will never come?" the collectors would shout through megaphones. "Bring us your voucher today and we will give you a bottle of Stolichnaya and a bag of sugar, cash in hand, right now." In the provincial towns, where the central heating had been cut off and the local grocery stores were empty, the choice was simple: keep a piece of paper that represented a theoretical future, or eat tonight. Millions chose to eat. The devil's agents roamed the countryside like harvesters, trading crates of vodka and cheap imported electronics for the legal rights to the world's largest natural gas reserves. It was a massive, decentralized heist, fueled by the desperation of a nation that had been stripped of its dignity. The villains were not just the men at the top, but the red directors of the factories themselves. These were the Soviet-era managers who had run the plants for decades. They collaborated with the 7 devils to ensure the workers remained ignorant. In many factories, managers threatened to fire any worker who didn't sell their voucher to the official investment fund, which in reality was a shell company owned by one of the 7 devils. Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky used their banks to provide the liquidity for these operations. They weren't using their own money, they were using the government's own funds parked in their private banks to buy the country from the government's people. It was a closed loop of corruption. They established voucher investment funds with patriotic-sounding names, promising to invest the people's certificates wisely. Instead, as soon as the funds were full of vouchers, the 7 devils would dissolve the companies, leaving the people with nothing and themselves with mountains of ownership certificates. The scale of the deceit was breathtaking. By 1994, nearly 150 million vouchers had been issued. By the time the dust settled, the vast majority of those vouchers had been funneled into a handful of holding companies. The winning tickets were collected in silk-lined briefcases in Moscow, while the people who had traded them were left with the hangovers from the vodka they had received in exchange. In one particularly dark instance, a massive nickel processing plant in the Arctic Circle, a facility worth billions on the global market, was effectively privatized for a few 100,000 vouchers. The workers, who lived in a city with no sun for half the year and whose life expectancy was 20 years below the global average, sold their shares for the price of a few loaves of bread. They were told the factory was failing, that it was a liability. Once the devils had 51% of the shares, the factory suddenly became the most profitable enterprise in the world. This was the true shock therapy. The shock was the realization that the state had not just collapsed, but had actively conspired to rob its children. The 7 devils didn't just collect tickets, they collected the future of the Russian working class. As the voucher phase of privatization ended, the landscape of Russia had changed forever. The egalitarian dream of the Soviet Union was replaced not by a vibrant middle class of shareholders, but a neo-feudalism where 7 men owned the air, the water, and the earth. The winning tickets were cashed, and the prize was a nation in chains. The 7 devils were no longer just businessmen, they were the owners of Russia's destiny. and as they looked at their piles of vouchers, they realized they were now ready for the next, even more audacious stage of the heist, the loans for shares scheme, the single greatest sleight of hand in financial history. By the middle of 1995, the Seven Devils had a problem. They had successfully looted the people's vouchers and amassed mountains of paper, but the Russian government was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had facilitated their rise, was a physical and political wreck. His approval ratings were in the single digits, the war in Chechnya was a bloody quagmire, and the state treasury was so dry that teachers and soldiers hadn't been paid in months. The architects of chaos knew that if Yeltsin lost the upcoming 1996 election, the communists would return to power. And if the communists returned, the Seven Devils wouldn't just lose their wealth, they would likely face a firing squad. It was in this atmosphere of panic and greed that the most audacious betrayal in financial history was born, the loans for shares scheme.
The plan was a masterstroke of predatory genius, devised primarily by Vladimir Potanin and whispered into the ears of the Kremlin's inner circle. The premise was deceptively simple. The Russian government needed cash to pay its debts and win an election. The private banks, owned by the Seven Devils, had that cash. The banks would lend money to the government, and in return, the government would provide collateral in the form of massive blocks of shares in the country's most valuable state-owned industries. But there was a catch, a trapdoor designed to swallow the nation's wealth. Everyone involved knew the government would never repay the loans. When the deadline passed, the banks would simply keep the collateral. These weren't just any factories, these were the crown jewels of Mother Russia. We are talking about Norilsk nickel, which produced a quarter of the world's nickel, Yukos and Sibneft, oil titans sitting on reserves that rivaled those of Saudi Arabia, and the massive shipping and steel conglomerates that formed the backbone of the Eurasian economy. The auctions held to distribute these shares were a grotesque parody of capitalism. They were rigged with the kind of shamelessness that only exists in a lawless frontier. For example, when the auction for Norilsk nickel was held, it was managed by Unexim Bank, which was owned by Vladimir Potanin. Unsurprisingly, the winner of the auction was a shell company also owned by Vladimir Potanin. He had essentially acted as the auctioneer, the bidder, and the judge. When a rival bank tried to submit a higher bid for the oil company Yukos, their bid was disqualified on a technicality. The bank's courier had supposedly arrived late, or the paperwork was not in the correct folder. Mikhail Khodorkovsky walked away with Yukos for a mere $309 million. Within a few years, the company would be valued at over $30 billion. The betrayal was not just in the price, it was in the theft of the nation's sovereignty. These industries belonged to the Russian people. They had been built with the blood of the Gulag and the sweat of millions of Soviet workers. Now, for the price of a few mid-sized American corporations, 7 men had gained control over the natural resources of an entire continent. The secret deal transformed the Seven Devils from wealthy businessmen into untouchable sovereigns. They no longer just influenced the Kremlin, they were the Kremlin. The money they lent to the government was immediately funneled back into Yeltsin's 1996 re-election campaign. They used their television stations to drown the country in pro-Yeltsin propaganda while erasing his rivals from the airwaves. The loans for shares deal was the moment the Russian state surrendered its power to the oligarchs. It was the birth of a system where the government existed only to protect the property of the few. While the Seven Devils celebrated in their villas on the Mediterranean, the Russian state was left nothing but the debt they had borrowed. The oil, the gas, and the gold were gone. The crown jewels had been hawked for a pittance, and the people of Russia were left to wander the ruins of a country that no longer belonged to them. This was the ultimate betrayal, a nation sold behind closed doors in a deal where the sellers were the politicians and the buyers were the devils they had created. By the year 1996, the transformation was complete. The Seven Devils had moved from the street corners of the voucher trade and the back rooms of the loans for shares auctions into the very heart of the Kremlin. They were no longer mere businessmen or even mere thieves. They were the bankers of the Kremlin, the shadow cabinet that held the fate of the Russian presidency in their manicured hands. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had once stood heroically on a tank to defend democracy, was now a ghost of his former self. Ravaged by heart disease and struggling with severe alcoholism, he was a leader whose grip on power was slipping as fast as his health. His approval rating had plummeted to a catastrophic 3%. The Russian people, exhausted by the shock therapy that had left them penniless, were turning back to the Communist Party. The specter of the Soviet Union's return haunted the hallways of the Kremlin. The oligarchs knew that if the Communists won the 1996 election, their empires would be nationalized and their lives would be forfeit. For the first time, the Seven Devils stopped fighting each other and formed a pact. This was the Davos Pact, named after the World Economic Forum meeting where they agreed to pool their resources to save Yeltsin and, by extension, themselves. They didn't just donate to his campaign, they took it over. They treated the presidency of the largest country on earth as a corporate merger. The Puppet Masters campaign. The bankers of the Kremlin understood that money alone wouldn't win an election for a man who could barely walk or speak. They needed to control the narrative. Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky, despite being bitter rivals, used their television networks, ORT and NTV, to launch a psychological warfare campaign against the Russian public. Every night, the airwaves were flooded with terrifying imagery of what a communist return would look like: gulags, breadlines, and civil war. Simultaneously, Yeltsin was repackaged as the only man who could prevent a return to the Dark Ages. The oligarchs hired American political consultants and spent hundreds of millions of dollars, far exceeding legal spending limits, to flood the country with vote or lose posters. Yeltsin was propped up like a marionette. When he suffered a heart attack just days before the runoff election, the news was suppressed by the media outlets the oligarchs owned. They showed old footage of him to give the illusion of health. They were not just buying votes, they were manufacturing a reality. The family and the hidden hand. Once Yeltsin was re-elected, the debt came due. The oligarchs moved into the family, the inner circle of Yeltsin's advisors, including his daughter Tatyana Gyatchenko. Boris Berezovsky became the deputy secretary of the Security Council. He wasn't just a banker anymore, he was a statesman with a diplomatic passport. The Kremlin became a marketplace. Ministerial appointments were vetted by the Seven Devils. Laws were drafted in the offices of their private banks before they were ever seen by the Duma. The president's health continued to fail, and in his periods of prolonged infirmity, the bankers of the Kremlin ruled by decree. They controlled the flow of information to the president's desk, ensuring that he only saw what they wanted him to see and signed what they wanted him to sign. This period was a regency of the rich. While the Russian state was unable to pay pensions to its elderly or salaries to its coal miners, the oligarchs were using state funds to subsidize their own lifestyles. They had achieved the ultimate dream of the predator. They had privatized the profits of the nation while socializing its losses. The bankers of the Kremlin didn't just own the oil and the media, they owned the red button. They decided foreign policy, negotiated with the IMF for loans that would immediately disappear into offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, and dictated the terms of the war in Chechnya based on how it affected their business interests. However, owning a president is a dangerous game. By hollowing out the presidency and making it a tool for their own greed, they destroyed the public's faith in democracy for a generation. They created a vacuum of authority that only a strong man could fill. They believed they were the masters of the game, but by making the presidency a puppet, they ensured that the next person to sit in that chair would have to be a tyrant to reclaim the power they had stolen. The Seven Devils sat in the Kremlin, clinking glasses of cognac, believing they had won history. They didn't realize that by owning the president, they had made themselves the primary targets for the storm that was coming. They had built a throne of glass, and the man who would eventually shatter it was already moving through the shadows of the FSB. In the winter of 1993, the air in Moscow didn't just feel cold, it felt lethal.
The city had become a sprawling, neon-lit theater of the macabre, where the boundaries between state power, corporate finance, and cold-blooded murder had dissolved into a gray slush. This was the era of the Red Mafia Nexus, a period when the Seven Devils realized that to own a country, one needed not just a bank account, one needed a private army and a direct line to the underworld. To understand this nexus, one must understand the Krisha. In the Russian language, the word literally means roof, but in the lawless 1990s, it was the most important word in the economy. Every business, from a sidewalk kiosk selling imported Snickers bars to a billion-dollar oil refinery, needed a roof. If you didn't have one, you didn't exist. The Seven Devils provided the most expensive and impenetrable roofs in the world, built from a foundation of corrupt police, former KGB snipers, and tattooed mob bosses.
The birth of this alliance was a matter of Darwinian necessity. When the Soviet state collapsed, it took the rule of law with it. The police were unpaid and humiliated, the courts were hollow shells, and contract law was a fantasy. In this vacuum, violence became the only reliable currency for dispute resolution. If a rival businessman cheated you, you didn't call a lawyer, you called a vor v zakone, a thief in law. The Seven Devils were the master orchestrators of this merger. They didn't just hire thugs, they institutionalized them. Men like Boris Berezovsky and Mikhail Khodorkovsky built security services that were essentially private intelligence agencies. They recruited heavily from the remnants of the KGB's elite 5th Directorate and the Spetsnaz units returning from the blood-soaked valleys of Afghanistan. These men brought with them a terrifying expertise in surveillance, intimidation, and active measures. The streets of Moscow became a battlefield of the aluminum wars. Aluminum was known as the winged metal, a commodity that brought in billions in hard Western currency. Control over the massive smelters in the Siberian tundra meant unimaginable wealth, and the Seven Devils wanted it all. The result was a decade-long massacre. Boardroom meetings often ended with a sudden burst of Kalashnikov fire in a parking lot. Professional hitmen, often dressed in delivery uniforms or police gear, moved through the shadows with surgical precision. Car bombings became so frequent that Muscovites learned to recognize the specific crump of a C4 charge over the sound of city traffic. These weren't random acts of chaos, they were market corrections. Each assassination was a transfer of shares, each disappearance was a corporate merger. The nexus was most visible in the laundromat system. The Seven Devils owned the banks, and the mafia provided the black cash, the mountains of untraceable rubles extorted from the population. Together, they moved this blood money through a labyrinth of shell companies in Cyprus, Gibraltar, and the British Virgin Islands, eventually buying luxury penthouses in London, in yachts in the Mediterranean. The oligarchs gave the criminals a way to clean their money. The criminals gave the oligarchs the muscle to keep their rivals in the ground. One of the most chilling aspects of this dark alliance was the Red Directors, the old Soviet managers of the factories. They often found themselves caught between the Moscow oligarchs and the local gangs. Many who refused to play along were simply erased. A factory director might be invited to a dacha for a friendly chat, only to have his body found weeks later in a frozen river. The message was clear. Russia was no longer a country, it was a crime syndicate with a flag. The Seven Devils also used the mafia to control the political landscape. Gang leaders were used to intimidate voters, harass investigative journalists, and convince regional governors to align with the Kremlin's chosen path. It was a symbiotic relationship where the line between a cabinet minister and a mob captain was often just a matter of which office they were sitting in that day. But there was a poison at the heart of this nexus. By feeding the monster of the security services and the criminal underworld to protect their fortunes, the Seven Devils were inadvertently creating their own replacement. They thought they were the masters of the roof, but they didn't realize that the enforcers they had hired, the middle-ranking officers of the FSB and the GRU, were watching them with growing resentment. These men of force saw the oligarchs getting rich off the chaos they provided, and they began to wonder why they were the ones pulling the triggers, while the bankers were the ones drinking the champagne. By the late 90s, the Red Mafia nexus had become the very fabric of Russian life. It had corrupted every institution, from the local precinct to the halls of the Duma. The Endostabre Bankov believed they had built an unbreakable system of control. They had the money, they had the media, and they had the muscle. What they failed to see was that in a world where everything has a price and violence is the only law, the most dangerous man isn't the one with the most money, it's the one who controls the men with the guns. As the decade drew to a close, the alliance began to fracture under the weight of its own brutality. The Seven Devils had won the war for Russia's assets, but they had turned their motherland into a wasteland of fear. They had invited the underworld into the boardroom, and now the underworld was ready to take the head of the table. In the middle of the 1990s, the Seven Devils realized a profound truce. In a country as vast and broken as Russia, he who controlled the image of reality controlled reality. They had already seized the oil, the banks, and the factories, but their most lethal acquisition was the Russian mind. This was the era of propaganda and power, where the television screen became the most powerful weapon in the Kremlin's arsenal, and the airwaves were used to perform a national lobotomy. The center of this psychological empire was Channel 1, ORT. Under the frantic, genius direction of Boris Berezovsky, the channel became more than a news source, it became a magic lantern. Berezovsky, a man who understood the mathematical probability of human behavior, knew that the Russian people, reeling from the trauma of the Soviet collapse, were desperate for a narrative. If the Seven Devils didn't provide one, the people might start looking at their empty bank accounts and wondering who had stolen the money. To prevent this, the oligarchs turned the news into a form of high-stakes theater. They didn't just report the news, they manufactured it. They hired the most brilliant, cynical journalists and directors, men who had been trained in the dark arts of Soviet agitation, but were now fueled by the limitless cash of the new capitalist elite. The primary goal of the media machine was the protection of the family, the inner circle surrounding Boris Yeltsin. By 1996, Yeltsin was a political corpse, a man whose physical trembling and slurred speech were the physical manifestation of the nation's decline. The bankers of the Kremlin knew that if Yeltsin fell, their roof fell with him. The propaganda campaign for the 1996 election was a masterclass in mass manipulation. Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned the rival NTV network, declared a temporary truce. They flooded the screens with a singular, terrifying message: vote or lose. They portrayed the communist challenger, Zyuganov, not as a political opponent, but as a harbinger of the apocalypse. They showed black and white footage of Stalinist purges, civil war, and starvation, implying that a vote against Yeltsin was a vote for the end of the world. Simultaneously, they used clever editing to hide Yeltsin's infirmity. When the president suffered a massive heart attack between the first and second rounds of voting, the Seven Devils didn't report it. Instead, they aired pre-recorded segments of a vibrant, healthy leader. They rewrote the physical state of the president in the minds of millions, ensuring that by the time the polls opened, the Russian public was voting for a ghost they believed was a hero. But the propaganda wasn't just about elections, it was about the daily privatization of truth. Every time one of the Seven Devils wanted to seize a new asset, perhaps a state-owned shipping company or a telecommunications giant, they would launch a media war. If a government minister stood in their way, the television channels would suddenly discover a scandal. Secretly recorded tapes of the minister with prostitutes or documents proving corruption would lead the evening news. The character assassination was so swift and so total that the target would be politically dead within 48 hours. This was the era of the compromat, compromising material used as a scalpel to remove any obstacle to the oligarch's greed. The most insidious part of the propaganda and power era was the way that it reshaped the Russian identity. The media glamorized the new Russians, the men in Versace suits and armored Mercedes, while portraying the struggling working class as losers of history. They imported American-style game shows and soap operas to distract the masses, creating a culture of hyper-consumption in a country where half the population couldn't afford meat. They turned the looting of the nation into a spectacle of reform. Every time a billion-dollar oil field was handed over to an oligarch for a pittance, the media framed it as a victory for the free market and a step towards Western civilization.
They used words like democracy and freedom as shields for theft, eventually curdling those very concepts in the hearts of the Russian people. By controlling the airwaves, the Endestablia Bankov felt they were invincible. They believed that as long as they owned the cameras, they owned the future. They didn't realize that they were training the Russian public to be cynical, to believe that all news was fake and that all leaders were puppets. They were building a stage, but they didn't notice that the audience was growing silent and bitter. They had created a world where reality was whatever the man with the most money said it was.
But in doing so, they left the door open for someone else to step onto that stage, someone who wouldn't just use the cameras to protect a bank account, but to rebuild a cult of personality that would eventually swallow the Seven Devils whole. The airwaves were full of noise, but beneath the propaganda, a dark, silent anger was brewing. The Seven Devils were in the driver's seat, steering the country with a remote control, but the road was leading toward a cliff that no amount of clever editing could hide. In the final days of the Yeltsin era, the propaganda became so detached from the reality of the starving provinces that it began to resemble a fever dream. While the people sold their furniture to buy bread, the television showed the oligarchs at the opera in St. Moritz. The gap between the image and the life was too wide to bridge. The Seven Devils had mastered the art of the lie, but they had forgotten that a lie can only hold back the truth until the lights go out. And in Russia, the lights were about to go out on the era of the Seven Devils forever. In the winter of 1997, Russia was a land of two different centuries, existing in the same frozen space but separated by an unbridgeable canyon of gold and blood. To walk the streets of Moscow was to witness a surreal Dickensian nightmare played out in the shadow of nuclear silos. This was the era of the people's poverty, the devil's feast, a time when the Seven Devils didn't just accumulate wealth, they flaunted it with a vulgarity that seemed designed to spit in the face of the starving. While the oligarchs were importing French marble to floor their mansions in Rubliovka, the rest of the nation was literally decomposing. In the industrial heartlands of the Urals, in the frozen reaches of Siberia, the social contract had been burned for warmth. Workers at massive state factories, now owned by shell companies in Cyprus, hadn't seen a paycheck in 18 months. They continued to show up at the gates out of a ghost-like habit, working in unheated shops where the grease froze on the machines, only to be paid in the very products they manufactured: a crate of rubber gaskets, a sack of coal, or a dozen rolls of industrial-grade toilet paper. Barter had replaced the ruble. Survival had replaced life. In the village squares, the scenes were even harrowing. Old women, the babushkas who had survived the siege of Leningrad and the terrors of the Great Patriotic War, stood for hours in the slush. They weren't waiting for a bus, they were selling their lives. One would hold a single pickled cucumber, another a pair of hand-knit socks, a third her husband's posthumous medals for bravery. They sold these remnants of their dignity just to buy a liter of milk or a loaf of the gray, sawdust-heavy bread that was the only thing the local kiosks had in stock. But as night fell, a different Russia emerged, the Russia of the Seven Devils. In Moscow's Golden Mile, the lights never flickered. While the provinces suffered through rolling blackouts, the elite gathered at clubs like the Metropole or the Sirena. Here, the devils held court. A single dinner for a group of oligarchs and their security details could cost more than the annual budget of a provincial hospital. They feasted on beluga caviar served on ice sculptures and drank Cristal champagne as if it were water, while just outside the reinforced glass windows, homeless children, orphans of the shock therapy, sniffed glue in the metro tunnels to dull the pangs of hunger. The contrast was not merely economic, it was biological. The oligarchs and their new Russian hangers-on looked like a different species. They were tanned from the beaches of Saint-Tropez, their teeth bleached, their bodies wrapped in Italian silk. Meanwhile, the average Russian male's life expectancy had plummeted to 57 years, a level seen only in the poorest nations of the Third World.
Alcoholism, stress-induced heart failure, and the return of forgotten diseases like tuberculosis were culling the population. Russia was a country losing 1 million people a year to excess mortality, a clinical term for the tragedy of being discarded by one's own country. The Devil's Feast extended to the very earth itself. The oligarchs didn't just buy yachts, they bought fleets. They didn't just buy houses, they bought entire zip codes in London and villas on the Côte d'Azur. Boris Berezovsky famously had his armored Mercedes flown to London on a private cargo plane because he didn't trust the local rentals. They lived in a bubble of hyper-luxury that required private armies to maintain. Their children were sent to boarding schools in Switzerland, shielded from the reality of the country their fathers were stripping bare. There was a profound psychological cruelty to this era. The state-controlled television, owned by the very men feasting, beamed images of this luxury into the cold, dark apartments of the poor. It was a form of gaslighting on a national scale. The people were told that their poverty was their own fault, that they were unfit for the new market economy, while the devils were portrayed as the heroic pioneers of a new age. In the mining town of Vorkuta, inside the Arctic Circle, the miners finally broke. They went on strike, but they didn't just walk out. They sat in the darkness of the pits, hundreds of meters underground, refusing to come up until they were paid. When the bankers of the Kremlin heard of this, they didn't send food or money. They sent consultants to explain that the global price of coal had dropped and that sacrifices were necessary for the transition to capitalism. The miners eventually emerged, skeletal and coughing, to find that their factory's owner had just purchased a professional football team in the West. This was the ultimate legacy of the 1990s, a nation where the common good had been replaced by private greed. The Seven Devils had feasted so ravenously that they had consumed the very stability of the nation. They had created a society of wolves and sheep, forgetting that when sheep are starved long enough, they don't just die, they look for a different kind of shepherd, one who promises to hunt the wolves. The Devil's Feast was at its peak in 1997, a glittering, decadent party held on the deck of a sinking ship. The contrast between the starving masses and the ultra-luxury elite had reached a breaking point. The air was thick with a silent, simmering resentment, a dark energy that was waiting for a catalyst. The Seven Devils thought they were untouchable, safe behind their roofs in their bank accounts, but the tragic hunger of the Russian people was about to give birth to a new era of vengeance. By the end of 1999, the Seven Devils were exhausted. The euphoria of the early 1990s had curdled into a permanent state of high-alert paranoia. They had survived the hyperinflation of the transition, the bloody street wars of the mid-90s, and the catastrophic financial crash of 1998. But now they were facing a threat they couldn't simply buy off or blow up: time. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had been their shield and their benefactor, was a physical wreck. His heart was failing, his speech was slurred, and his approval ratings had vanished. The oligarchs knew that if a truly independent leader took power in the upcoming millennium, the first thing they would do is hang the bankers of the Kremlin on the lampposts of Red Square for the looting of the century. They needed a successor who was invisible. They didn't need a visionary or a populist hero. They needed a gray cardinal, a quiet, loyal bureaucrat who would protect their assets, grant the family immunity from prosecution, and allow the status quo to continue. The Seven Devils, led by the increasingly arrogant Boris Berezovsky, believed they had found the ultimate puppet. Berezovsky, who fancied himself the kingmaker of Eurasia, boasted to his inner circle that he could program this man like a computer. He believed that a man from the intelligence services would be grateful for the chance to sit in the big chair and would naturally defer to the geniuses who had built the new Russian economy. They nicknamed him the Enforcer, but in their private dachas they laughed at his lack of charisma. Berezovsky used his vast media empire, specifically Channel One, to launch an overnight branding campaign that was nothing short of a psychological miracle. He took this unknown officer and turned him into a national hero. The television screens were flooded with images of a young, fit, sober leader, a stark contrast to the stumbling Yeltsin. During the Second Chechen War, which broke out conveniently just as the election cycle began, the media portrayed him as the man of iron who would waste the terrorists in the outhouse. Through orchestrated propaganda, the public was introduced to a savior they hadn't known they needed.
The oligarchs funded the campaign with the same predatory zeal they had used in 1996. They opened their offshore coffers, thinking they were buying a lifetime insurance policy for their oil fields and nickel mines. On New Year's Eve, 1999, when a tearful Yeltsin resigned and handed the nuclear briefcase to the new enforcer, the Seven Devils popped champagne. They believed they had successfully executed the greatest changing of the guard in history, ensuring that the puppet would keep the curtains drawn while they continued to pick the pockets of the nation. The realization that they had made a catastrophic error did not come as a sudden explosion, but as a series of cold, sharp shocks. Shortly after the inauguration, the new president called a meeting with the Big Seven. They arrived at the Kremlin expecting the usual subservience, expecting the president to ask for their list of preferred cabinet ministers. Instead, they were ushered into a long, cold hall. The new leader didn't offer the usual cognac or cigars. He didn't even smile. In a voice as flat as a Siberian steppe, he delivered the ultimatum that changed Russia forever. He offered them what historians call the grand bargain. They could keep the wealth they had stolen in the 1990s, the villas in France and the yachts in the Mediterranean, but only under one condition. They must stay out of politics entirely. No more choosing ministers, no more controlling the news, no more owning the presidency. The state, he reminded them, was no longer for sale. The oligarchs were stunned, but Berezovsky, the most hubristic of the lot, didn't believe it. He had spent a decade outmaneuvering the Russian government, and he thought he could fire his creation just as easily as he had hired him. He went back to his television station and began to launch critical reports against the Kremlin's handling of the Kursk submarine disaster, thinking he could bully the enforcer into submission. He was wrong. The new president didn't play by the rules of the 1990s. He didn't use the media to argue. He used the state's tax inspectors, the secret police, and the judiciary, the very tools the oligarchs had helped sharpen. Within months, Berezovsky, the man who had once been the godfather of the Kremlin, found himself a fugitive, fleeing to London as his assets were seized. Vladimir Gusinsky followed shortly after, his media empire dismantled and handed over to state-controlled entities. The final definitive blow to the old guard was the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky in 2003. As the head of the oil giant Yukos, he was the richest man in Russia and the only one who still dared to challenge the enforcer openly. In a move that sent shockwaves through the global financial markets, special forces stormed his private jet on a Siberian runway. He wasn't just exiled, he was put in a metal cage in a Moscow courtroom. It was a visual signal to the entire world. The Seven Devils were no longer the masters of Russia. As the original oligarchs were imprisoned, exiled, or reduced to silent obedience, a chilling realization swept through the boardrooms of Moscow. The puppet hadn't just cut his strings, he had used them to garrote his masters. The changing of the guard was complete, but it wasn't the transition to a Western-style democracy that the world had been promised. It was the birth of a new kind of autocracy, a vertical of power. The enforcer had taken the infrastructure of corruption the oligarchs had built, the rigged courts, the state-controlled media, the secret police alliances, and simply changed the person at the top. The Seven Devils had spent the 1990s destroying the state so they could rob it. In doing so, they had left the country so broken and desperate that when a man promised to bring order, the people didn't care if that order came at the cost of their freedom. The oligarchs had paved the road for their own destruction. They had bought a presidency, only to find that the presidency now owned them, their assets, and their future. The era of the chaotic heist was over. The era of the disciplined empire had begun. The dust from the collapse of the Soviet Union has long since settled, but the tremors from that explosion still vibrate through the halls of power from Washington to Beijing.
The legacy of the looting is not merely a chapter in a history book. It is the invisible foundation upon which the modern geopolitical landscape is built. When the Seven Devils auctioned off the Russian soul in the 1990s, they didn't just redistribute wealth, they rewired the global economy and created a blueprint for a new kind of autocracy that would haunt the 21st century. The first and most enduring scar left by the Great Heist is the deep cellular cynicism it planted in the Russian heart. A generation of Russians was told that democracy meant the theft of their life savings, and capitalism meant the right of a few men to feast while millions starved. This trauma created a massive psychological vacuum that was eventually filled by a fierce, vengeful nationalism. The West, by cheering on the rapid privatization while ignoring the blatant criminality of the Seven Devils, effectively poisoned the well of liberalism in the East. Today's global shift towards strongman politics can find its roots in the wreckage of 1990s Moscow, where the failure of the free market to provide basic dignity made the promise of order more seductive than the promise of liberty. Beyond the borders of Russia, the looting reshaped the very nature of global finance. The Seven Devils were the pioneers of the modern offshore world. To hide the billions stolen during the loans for shares era, they developed a sophisticated labyrinth of shell companies, trusts, and shadow banks that stretched from the Cayman Islands to the City of London. This infrastructure didn't disappear when the original oligarchs were replaced. It expanded. The Russian laundromat became the model for kleptocrats worldwide, proving that you could rob a nation and then use its own wealth to buy legitimacy in the West. This flow of dark money has since corrupted Western real estate markets, influenced political campaigns in Europe and America, and turned global capitals like London into Londongrad, where the rule of law often bows to the weight of anonymous gold. The legacy also redefined the concept of energy security as a weapon of war. By allowing the Seven Devils to consolidate the world's largest oil and gas reserves into private hands, which were then seized by a centralized state, the auction of Russia gave birth to the era of the energy superpower. The pipelines that were once seen as bridges between East and West became levers of coercion. The wealth generated by these assets didn't build a diverse Russian economy, it built a war chest. The billions that once flowed into the pockets of the Seven Devils now fuel a military-industrial complex that challenges the global order, proving that the auction of 1995 provided the capital for the invasions and interventions of the 2020s. Then furthermore, the rise of the enforcer who replaced the Seven Devils was a direct reaction to the chaos they orchestrated. The world we live in today, characterized by a Russia that is isolated, defiant, and driven by a sense of historical grievance, is the mirror image of the 1990s. The new elite, the Siloviki, justified their iron-kissed control by pointing to the Seven Devils as the ultimate villains. They argued that only a total concentration of power could prevent the Western-backed looters from returning. In this sense, the greed of the Seven Devils provided the perfect permanent alibi for autocracy. Finally, the legacy of the looting serves as a grim warning about the fragility of institutions. It proved that in the absence of a moral framework and a functioning legal system, the transition to a market economy can easily devolve into a mafia state. The auction of Russia showed that you cannot build a democracy on a foundation of theft. As we look at the scars left on global politics, the shattered alliances, the rise of disinformation, and the return of great power competition, we see the fingerprints of those seven men who once thought they could buy a superpower for pennies. The story of the Seven Devils is a reminder that when a nation is sold, it is never just the factories and the oil that are traded, it is the future. The auction ended decades ago, but the world is still paying the interest on that debt. The scars remain unhealed, defining the boundary between a world that hoped for peace and a world that was reshaped by a heist.